Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Well, hello and welcome. Today we're going to have our second in a series of 3 lectures this week from Professor Frank Perkins from the Philosophy Department at DePaul University, currently visiting at Nanyang Technological University. As I said, for those of you who were here yesterday, we'll be picking up the discussion here. Professor Perkins, again, just to reiterate, a well-known Leibniz scholar of comparative philosophy of Leibniz and China, an expert in, recently published a book very closely related to this topic, Heaven and Earth Are Not Benevolent, Problem of Evil in Early China. And so, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Perkins to the
Well, let me thank Brooke again for inviting me, and thank you all for coming also. There's a lot of other stuff going on. So the last lecture, I talked primarily about methodology and about trying to think about the problem of evil in a comparative context, and trying to find sort of a more kind of primitive sort of root in experience that we can then look at this in a more cross-cultural context, right? And the kind of thread that I picked out then was just the observation that bad things happen to good people, right? And what kind of questions does that raise? What kind of problems does that raise? And I kind of introduced the Chinese context there. What I want to do today is really look at one particular strand of how that problem works out in early China, particularly then around the idea of generation and impartiality, right? How those align with each other. I'll start off though by talking a bit about the problem of evil again, kind of how to frame it. But kind of another way to look at the problem to get at it in a cross-cultural context. So one of the things that's most striking when you look at something like analogs to the problem of evil in classical China is how on one side they were very quick to give up the idea that there was a good God who determines the content of ethics and enforces that ethics, right? Ensures that good people get rewarded and bad people get punished. So aside from the Mohists, I think everyone had given up that idea by the 4th century BC, right?
One moment. Go ahead, sorry.
Right, and I think we could give various reasons for why they were so quick to give that view up. One obvious one is that they didn't have a conception of punishment and reward in the afterlife. And it's not just that they don't mention it. I think the Mohists would use that argument if they had it available, right? So I take it that that was just not a kind of possibility to them that they had thought about. Without that, it's pretty hard to deny that sometimes good people end up with bad lives, right? More fundamentally, there's the inseparability of heaven, or Tian, the kind of divine, from the natural world, right? And so looking at the natural world, it seems clear that it doesn't always work in a fair or good way, and there's no way to really separate heaven from that because heaven's already implicit in the natural world. So I think if you have a God who's outside of nature, right, it gives you some kind of interpretive space to say why that God might have created this natural world. That gap gives you some space to explain things that was missing in China, right? So facing just this natural world and just one life, it was pretty hard to deny that sometimes things work out in an unjust, unfair way, right? So on the one hand, they give up that kind of defense of, that kind of theodicy, right? The defense of God against the problem of evil very quickly. But what's striking is on the other side, they maintain a generally positive view of nature, keeping a sense of reverence, humility, and gratitude toward nature, right? They all assume that if human beings stopped harming each other and worked together, everyone could have a pretty good life. So you could say, in terms coming from the European problem of evil, they were not very concerned with what would be called natural evil, things like earthquakes, floods. And it's actually interesting that when they talk about floods, that's almost always still blamed on human beings, because the idea is that if you store grain, if you have 3 years of grain in storage, if you don't get rain for a couple of years, nobody starves. If you have dams built and the rivers dredged, then if you get a lot of rain, it all drains out. So even things like floods and famines were generally blamed on people rather than on nature. Again, the reasons for this positive view of nature, is hard to say. Part of it might just be that at that time, right, it was called the Warring States period, human beings were causing an immense amount of misery for each other, right? And in that kind of context, you could imagine people thinking that a world in which your only problem was too much rain or an earthquake would be quite good compared to the world they were in, right? So they maybe naturally focus more on human evil and kind of idealize what it would be like if human beings weren't doing such bad things. I think that the lack of what I would call radical transcendence, right? This inability to separate heaven and nature has a role here as well, because in the same way that you can't separate the kind of apparent moral indifference of the natural world from the divine, you can't separate the kind of reverence that was held toward the divine from the natural world. So there's a kind of bleeding over between the two, you could say, right? So that there's this kind of, even when they start to think that heaven is not particularly good, they still have this sense of kind of reverence toward the natural world. So we could say that the Chinese took a kind of middle course between two extremes. One would be to deny the problem of evil and maintain that there is a God who's perfectly good, right? The other hand would be to accept the problem of evil and have a kind of radically disenchanted view of nature in which human beings are simply in opposition to nature, right? So Europe tended to fall into one of those two positions. Either you hold on to the idea that everything works out fairly, or you have this kind of totally disenchanted view of nature where essentially human beings are in struggle with nature, right? So the Chinese, I think, work a kind of middle course between those two alternatives. And I think that's why it's interesting, right? Because I think that's, in a way, what a lot of us feel like we need, right? Some middle course between those two extremes. We could say, I mean, using kind of foreign terms, we could say that they had a system that was not based on God, but also not based on the death of God, right? That was just not an issue in there at all, right? And this is what's interesting about it to me, is that it's not so strongly theistic, but it's also not anti-theistic, right? It's simply plotting a different course, which I think works out to be a kind of middle ground between those alternatives, right? So you never get this kind of, I would say, kind of arrogant humanism or anthropocentrism that sees human beings as separate from nature and meant to control nature, right? What you actually get is a consistent concern with following nature or harmonizing with nature or with connecting with nature, right? And that's true even for figures who are mostly exceptions, like, say, Zhuangzi. Even there's still some concern with harmonizing with nature, with fitting into nature. And so I think I want to kind of, this question of following nature, use that as another way to look at the problem of evil, right? And so last time I laid out the problem of evil as essentially a contradiction between these first 2 points, right? So one is a roughly anthropocentric ethics, by which I mean one that privileges human beings. So it could be one that extends beyond just concern for human beings, right? But it's focused primarily on human beings or centers on human beings. And then the observation that the world itself does not seem to be ordered according to that ethics, right? This necessarily, I think, makes us feel like our ethics might be baseless, right? Like we're sort of cut off from the root of existence, something like that. As a logical problem, you have the third premise, right? Belief in a divine being responsible for the order of the world and acting according to our ethical categories. But I think that really is a kind of, I think actually a kind of manifestation of the conflict between the first two. It's really a way of trying to deal with the first two by saying that there's a divine being who somehow reconciles these, right? So I think it's primarily between the first two. But another way to look at this, right, would be to ask the question, if we acted like God seems to have acted in creating the world, could we be considered moral, right? That's a way of saying if we followed along with the way the world seems to be. So if we just think about, well, there's all kinds of examples, right? But just think about Ebola, right? Put it in Africa where people are already sort of suffering in a lot of different ways, intertwine it with racism then, right? Is there any way that a person could do something like that and not be considered evil, actually, right? I don't think there is, right? And you could think about all the ways, the various injustices of how things work, right? So the point is, we couldn't, with our ethics that we have, with our morality that we have, try to imitate the way the world seems to be designed. And I think if we instead of asking about God, we say, can we follow nature and be ethical? We would run into the same problems, right? But then you can see the problem in the Chinese context, because I said, that all of the Chinese philosophers to some degree want to hold on to following nature, right? So that's really the question I want to look at today, is how to think about following nature and maintain some kind of morality, right? I think ultimately one can't, actually, right? I think that ultimately the way the progression works out ends up with a kind of overturning of morality. But I think it's interesting to look at the progression and to think about if it's a necessary progression or not, right? And I think that here there are some kind of comparisons that one could make. Because I think that what is happening with this focus, particularly on generation, is pretty close to an attempt to derive ethics from the very nature of being itself. And in that way, it's similar, I think, to Spinoza. It's maybe even closer to Leibniz. So Leibniz says the nature of being is to manifest something like complexity, right? And then morality for us is just to extend that process, basically, right? Other examples that would be less moralistic would be something like Nietzsche, where I think the fundamental drive for existence, how we should live, is really an expression of the same drive that's behind all natural phenomenon, right? The will to power, as he ends up describing it. But really, I think it goes to even a kind of deeper problem in theology, which is anything that relies on what's called the ontological argument, right? Something like that. That's the argument. Usually it's presented in a way that sounds very sophistical. That would be, kind of by definition, God must exist because God is all powerful and that involves an existence, right? But if we think about God as total maximum being, the statement really is that being by its very nature must exist, right? That's the way that Spinoza takes it. And there the idea is that so being must exist, and if it must exist as much as possible. And that's God, right? God is maximum being, maximum power. And normally people make the move to say that that itself determines that God would be good, right? So God as ultimate power, ultimate being, that's usually we try to take that as saying that that necessarily would make God good. And in fact, how is that done? The main way that's done is a sense of generosity and creativity, right? So that an all-powerful being would make stuff, right? And that's actually not so far from this underlying insight in the Chinese side, that to exist is something like to be generative, to be vital, to grow, and that's then what sort of morality develops out of. Now again, I think that in the Chinese context, it kind of works out to show that that doesn't really work, that argument, right? And that's what I kind of want to trace out today. But that's just kind of set it in a kind of broader comparative context. So on the Chinese side, the main basis for reconciling ethics and nature is around these two concepts, I think. Right. So one is sheng, which would mean to grow or to generate or to give birth or to live. Chinese philosophers themselves, of course, recognize that this was one of the fundamental concepts for them. The I Ching says that the foundations of the I of the changes is sheng sheng, which would be, well, it could be translated like a million different ways. It's repeating the same word. It could be a noun and a verb or two verbs. I did it as two verbs, generating, generating, growing and growing, living and living. It could be translated as natura naturans, right? Nature, naturing itself or something like that. The character originally was supposed to be a picture of a sprout growing up from the ground, and so I put a copy of one of the, I think it's from the Jiaoguwen character, the original character. The second one is this idea of gong, of inclusivity or impartiality. I think it's linked to the Moist idea of Jan, which also meant sort of inclusivity, impartiality, but in this context, the primary term that's used is this term gong. Okay, so I want to start off then by looking at the Tao Te Ching to get this more positive view of nature. So the Tao Te Ching makes very strong claims for the ability of human beings to live decent lives if they follow the Tao, right? That can't really be taken in moral terms because I think the Tao Te Ching is not working on a moral, non-moral distinction. But it looks suspiciously like morality, right? It includes the things that we normally think a good person would do, right? So it requires opposition to violence, opposition to oppression, opposition to inequality, against greed, those kinds of things, right? This way of acting then that avoids these harms at least is meant to both model nature and channel the generative force of nature, right? So in one way you look at nature and can follow the patterns, but more fundamentally, you become a kind of expression of the Tao yourself. And this is by doing non-action, by sort of embodying ziran, spontaneity, right? So that requires that alignment then between the way to act and the Tao as a kind of ontological principle, right? A kind of generative force in nature, requires seeing the forces of nature as generally supporting a sustainable and satisfying human life, right? So we might think that this goodness or supportiveness of nature is based on its, say, harmony, regularity, sustainability, moderation. And all those are mentioned, but that isn't actually the focus in this time period. I think near the end of the Warring States and then into the Han Dynasty, that becomes the dominant viewpoint, right? But I think in the Warring States period, it's really much more on this sense of vitality and generation is really the foundation. So I'll give you one passage that sort of explicitly praises the Tao. It actually says the reason why we honor the Tao is because it generates things, right? So it says, Tao generates them, Da raises them, things form them, tools complete them. Therefore the 10,000 things respect Tao and honor Da. Respect for Tao and honor for Da, nothing forces it, but it is constantly so of itself. Tao births them, raises them, grows them, supports them, shapes them, matures them, nurtures them, covers them, letting them be born but not possessing them, letting them act but not relying on them, letting them grow but not controlling them. This is called profound Da. I didn't translate Da there. I talked about it some last time, where it's translated usually as virtue. But it's an extremely complicated concept because it involves a sense of acting in the proper way, but also the kind of power that comes from acting in the proper way. And those are usually linked through some connection to the divine, to heaven, or to the Tao here. In the Tao Te Ching, it's using Da in an unusual way to label some kind of power within the universe itself, some kind of generative power, right? So in this, right, the term generates is a translation of this word sheng that I've been talking about. The term that I've translated as raises is chu, which means, it's actually a word that would be used for raising or nurturing livestock. That's kind of the root meaning of that character, right? So both of these aspects of the Tao as giving birth, sort of initially generating and then taking care of and raising something are captured in the descriptions of the Tao as like a mother, right? That appears in several places. Another place says that when heaven sort of will help someone, it will use nurturing care. And the term there is tsi, which means the care parents have for a child, right? Maybe particularly motherly care for a child, maybe. So it's because of this generative nurturing function that things honor the Tao and Da, right? It's significant that it says that things do this. So it's not just that human beings do this. The sense is human beings are just one of all the things that Tao generates, right? And they're not in some kind of privileged position there. So you can see how the Tao Te Ching here takes a very optimistic view of nature. And I think it's problematic how optimistic it is, right? If we take the Tao as encompassing nature as a whole, then the claim that it just generates things seems like it has to be false, right? Because nature generates everything, cares for it like a mother, but unlike mothers, usually, it also destroys everything, right? And it seems like those have to be equally balanced. Like if nothing lasts forever, then anything that's born will ultimately end up dying. So the Tao Te Ching's descriptions of nature are very selective as descriptions of nature, right? So it doesn't even mention, say, natural death of old age, let alone things like, floods or disease or those kinds of things. And you see that in this line just describes the Tao, right? Tao births them, raises them, grows them, supports them, shapes them, matures them, nurtures them, covers them. But then it doesn't make them wither, like it doesn't make them die, it doesn't crush them sometimes, right? All that's left out of these descriptions of the Tao as this kind of generative force. So in part, I think the Tao Te Ching deals with this by separating destructive forces from the Tao itself. So I think it's significant that the first series, right, gives 4 stages, but the rest of it only talks about the first 2, and it only says that we honor the first 2, right? So we don't honor things, even though they're necessary, and we don't honor the tools that make things complete. I take it that part of the Tao Te Ching's view is that destruction and harm happens on that level, right, and is in some way separated from the Tao. But even setting that aside, I think we could find some ways, we could think about how to justify this focus on generation, right? And the way to think about it would be this. If life and death were sort of equally balanced, the creative and the destructive, we would expect that there would be times like this where there's life all around, but that there'd be long periods of just sort of total extinction with nothingness, right? That would be a true balance of life and death. But that's not the case, right? Life is always going on and always going on, and that makes death seem more like it's part of the process of life rather than a kind of opposite to life, right? So we could in fact think about death as simply transformation, right? We could think about death as simply kind of making space for more life and more generation. And I think this is the kind of point that the Tao Te Ching is relying on in emphasizing just the generative aspect of the Tao, right? Or the I Ching, when it says the foundation is sheng sheng, it doesn't mention, it's not like sheng si, it's not life and death, it's just the life part, right? Because the sense in which that is actually the fundamental thing, right? And death is a kind of moment within that broader process. I think it differs in some obvious ways, but I think that there are some analogies with arguments for the priority of being in European philosophy. And here again, I think of Spinoza, right, and Leibniz would both be examples of that, where, for both Spinoza and Leibniz, the fact that anything exists at all shows that being has a kind of absolute priority over nothingness. And thus destruction can only be the transformation of more being, the generation of more being. There is no real nothingness in either of their systems, right? Because basically their view is that if anything exists at all, then there will only be being, right? And so what we see as destruction is really just generation of something new, more change. I think Chinese philosophers are relying on a similar kind of insight in taking Sheng as fundamental rather than life and death as fundamental. And of course, this idea of Sheng is much more concrete than the idea, a kind of abstract idea of being. Although it's not that far from, I think, say, Spinoza or Leibniz's idea of being, where being involves conatus, right, striving, generation, those kinds of things. And I think it's worth noting here that there's sometimes a claim that Chinese philosophy lacks ontology, right? It lacks the study of being as such. And that's sometimes taken to mean it doesn't have metaphysics, and it's sometimes taken to mean that it doesn't really have philosophy. If we take philosophy as Aristotle at some point says, the study of being as such. I think that's actually fundamentally wrong. Right. I think the case is that the Chinese would say that Europe had a mistaken view of being, right? If being simply means bare existence, I think they would say that that's an abstraction, right, from the absolute. Being really has to itself involve some kind of striving toward growth and existence, and I would say some kind of patterns, some kind of order, right? So I think the Chinese would say that Sheng that's what being is. You know what I mean? Like, you don't get anything more simple than that. That would just be a kind of bare existence or something like that. It does have weird consequences because it does mean that ontology ends up being kind of the same as cosmology, I think. In the sense that you can't have a study of being that's not a study of growth and production, right? Okay, so you can see how if the human good is to live, right, then the human good would align with this priority of fostering life in nature, right? But there's some problems with the connection. I think you see the seeds of the problem in the other common element of nature that's emphasized as positive, which is this impartiality or this inclusivity. So in the Tao Te Ching, this is usually expressed in negative terms. It usually says like not biased rather than using gong, say, right? But so here's one example. It says, the way of heaven has no familial attachments. It is constantly with good people. The word I'm translating as familial attachments is qin, which is actually the word for parents, but came to mean the kind of special cherishing that you would have toward parents or to people who are particularly close to you. So the point here is that heaven has no attachments like that, right? It has no preferences. It simply responds to good people, right? To be consistent, good here has to be used in a sense of meaning sort of skillful with the Tao or something like that, right? For that to fit in with the overall picture. I think the frequent emphasis that the Tao doesn't, once it produces things, it doesn't control them, it doesn't rely on them, is also putting forth an idea of impartiality, really. It produces things, but then sort of leaves them on their own. It doesn't interfere once things are produced and generated. In the Tao Te Ching, this impartiality of the way is also expressed sometimes through a tendency toward leveling or equality. So that appears also in a passage near the end of the text that says, The way of heaven is like pulling a bow. What is high it restrains, what is low it lifts up. What is extra it reduces, what lacks it aids. Thus the way of heaven is to reduce what has extra and increase what lacks. The way of people is to reduce what lacks and add to what has extra. Now who can have extra and have something to offer to heaven? Isn't it only one with the way? Thus sagely people act but do not possess, complete their work but do not dwell on it. In this way they do not desire to be seen as worthies. It's worth noting that the final line there is very similar to the final line of the earlier chapter that was describing Tao, right? So in the same way that the Tao produces things but does not possess them or hold on to them, sagely people do the same thing. This again shows how there's this sense of a kind of imitation of the natural processes connected with the Tao. So, okay, if we take these two elements together, we could say that nature promotes life and equality. So when sages promote those values, they're simply continuing the processes of nature itself, right? This is the kind of alignment that they're trying to get with nature. Now, if we put it in those terms, you can see, I think, the continuity with the Moists, with the Mozi, right? So the aspect of the way as generating life clearly echoes Moist claims that heaven cares for and benefits the world. And in fact, the Mozi at one point says that heaven loves life, Shang, right? The Tao Te Ching's claim that the way has no familial bias follows the other key Moist claim about heaven, which is that it's impartial or inclusive. So of course the Moists take heaven in anthropomorphic terms, arguing that heaven sort of deliberately promotes these values and deliberately punishes people who go against them. And they do sometimes rely on that anthropomorphism because they'll sort of reason like, if you were in heaven's position, what would you do? Right, so that kind of anthropomorphism is relied on in those cases. But we can't forget that the Moists think heaven is only known through the world, right? Heaven doesn't give any direct commands, there's nothing like that. So the idea that heaven rewards people who care inclusively is really to say that the natural world or the world itself is ordered in such a way that if you care for other people inclusively, you will benefit, right? To say that all people are sustained by and belong to heaven is really to say that we all equally belong to and live from the natural world. And here it helps to recall that Tian, heaven, is also the word for the sky, and that the word for the world itself is Tian Xia, which would be like under the sky or under heaven, right? So we can look at one line that I think captures this kind of ambiguity, right? And this is actually from an early chapter of the Mozi, although I think it's a Moist part of it, right? It says, the actions of heaven are broad and without private concern. Its extension is generous and does not cease. Its illumination is long-lasting and does not wane. Thus sagely kings model themselves after it. There's a kind of beautiful ambiguity in this passage because the word I'm translating as actions, xing, could also be used to talk about the sort of movements of the sky, right? And Tian itself could be a kind of god, or it could refer to the sky. So that first phrase really could be the actions of that god that we call Tian, or it could be the sort of circling heavens above us, right? Similarly, the character Ming, I translate as illumination, is the character that was used for seeing and judging people as doing good or bad things. So if you were here the last lecture, I talked about an excavated text called the discernment of ghosts and spirits, right? That word I translate there as discernment is the same word. So it could be saying, you know, God will see you whatever you do, but that same word simply means also to shine brightly, right? The character itself is made up of the sun and the moon together. It often is connected with a sense of impartiality. And in fact, Zhuangzi takes up the same term as a way of dealing with the world without making sort of fast distinctions on things, right? So this could be a description of a God that we should follow, but it could be read just as well as a description of the natural world that we take as our model, right? And I think, in fact, it's both, because heaven is really merged into the natural world. One other passage that I think shows the same idea of modeling nature is this one, also from an early chapter. It says, the virtue of sage people is high like the heavens and common like the earth, shining on all under heaven. It is firm like the earth and lofty like the mountains, not breaking and not collapsing. It is like the glow of the sun and the illumination of the moon, with the same constancy as heaven and earth. Right. I think that's a clear example of the Moists conceiving of their idea of impartial care, inclusive care, as a kind of imitation of the natural world itself. Right, so you can see then how this would work as a model. So on the one hand, nature is impartial, right? The sun and moon shine on all things equally. The benefits of nature are equally accessible to all people, seems to be the Moist view. there are occasions where the Mohists specifically say that heaven treats everyone impartially. So one says, heaven does not distinguish between poor and rich, honorable and lowly, distant and near, close relatives or distant ones. The worthy are raised and elevated, the unworthy are restrained and rejected, right? So this is meant to be a description of heaven itself. And these arguments point towards something like a conception of natural equality, right? So I think the point is that in the context of nature, all human beings are the same and of equal value. So distinctions like between my family and your family, or my state and your state, or my body and your body even, are basically impositions on that basic reality, which is that heaven has produced everything, right? So on top of that, then, impartiality, you have this idea of heaven as generative, of caring, because it provides the resources that we need. And again, the Mohists are quite explicit that if people didn't mess things up, everybody would have what they needed, right? So the fact that people are starving is directly blamed on the upper classes taking too much and liking to go to war. This example of the Mohists, though, I think starts to point to the problem that comes out of trying to derive an ethics from the tendencies of nature or of being itself. The fundamental problem for the Mohists is that the generative aspect of nature points toward a more radical inclusivity, right? And what I mean by that is, if heaven cares inclusively for everything that it generates, shouldn't it care equally for all of nature, right? So the sun, the moon, the seasons should be there to benefit all things, not just to benefit human beings. So the Mohists there rely on this anthropomorphic conception of Tien to say that you should care for all human beings equally, but to draw the line there, right? Their actual arguments point toward a more radical thing where you would care for everything equally, right? All living things at least. That conclusion is drawn by Hui Shi, who was a friend of Zhuangzi, who in the last chapter of the Zhuangzi describing different philosophical positions describes his position as this: care overflowingly for all the myriad things, heaven and earth form one body. And what's interesting is that same Zhuangzi chapter uses that same phrase, care overflowingly, to describe the Mohists, right? And there's some evidence for thinking that Hui Shi's lineage could have come out of the Mohists, right? In any case, I think it is a kind of logical conclusion to draw from the Mohist position, that one should move to this, right? Not just care for all human beings inclusively, but care for everything. And this idea that heaven and earth form one body is interesting because that adds sort of another dimension to the inclusivity. So it's not just that everything is sort of equally a product of nature. Everything is ultimately interconnected and forms one whole, right? And this, again, goes along with this element of equality or impartiality. The best example of this is in the Lu Shi Chunqiu, I think. So it starts off with a more kind of a direct kind of claim, right? The world is not one person's world, but the world's world. The harmony of yin-yang does not just grow one kind. Sweet dew and timely rain are not partial to one thing. The birth of the myriad peoples is not in favor of one person. I think it's kind of really a great statement, right? Given that it was 240 BC, sometime around then. Next, it leads into a kind of anecdote about a guy who loses a bow. And this is, I assume, a bow and arrow. It is a bow and arrow bow. A person of Jing lost a bow and was not willing to search for it, saying, a person of Jing lost it, a person of Jing will find it, so why search? Right, so he figures he lost it, but somebody else will find it and use it. Someone from his state will find it and use it, so he's not going to bother looking for it. He'll just let them have it, right? Kongzi heard this and said, if you leave out Jing, then it is acceptable. Right, so if you were to say a human being lost it, a human being will find it, that would be okay. It's actually probably more of a Mohist viewpoint than a Confucian viewpoint. Confucius would probably hope that like someone in your family would find it or something, but anyway. Lao Dan heard this and said, if you leave out person, then it is acceptable. Thus it was Lao Dan who reached the utmost impartiality. And I think this is, again, this is one of my favorite passages out of Chinese philosophy, really. And it's really kind of beautiful and clever what Lao Tzu says there, right? But it's also really a radical claim, because what Lao Tzu is really doing there is eliminating the very possibility of loss, right? I mean, if there's no limit on who finds it, anything is found, right? So I mean, if the bow falls in the forest, worms will eventually eat it, mushrooms will grow on it. In a minute, there'll be stuff that's using it, right? So it undoes the possibility of loss. I think it undermines any kind of commitment to changing the world then, right? I mean, in that sense, it's pointing toward a kind of not just an overcoming, it's an ethics that's so non-anthropocentric that it's hard to even think of it as an ethic, right? And that, I think, is the trajectory that I think this view tends toward. Okay, so, but you might still take this as some kind of an ethic, right? And I think the quote from Hui Shi is meant to be an ethical claim that because nature impartially generates things, we should impartially support all living things, right? And so you have a kind of ethical imperative to support life, to support generation. And that appears in a few places. You see, I think, traces of it in parts of the Zhuangzi, where some of the sagely characters are associated with generation and vitality, right? So one mentions some kind of sagely figure who, it says, when he walked by, roosters and hens would copulate. And I think it's meant to be a little silly, but it's meant to show that his mere presence makes things reproduce and grow, right? Another one talks about somebody who sort of stopped pestilence and made the crops grow on time. This is another example, right? It says, my teacher, regulating the myriad things, but not doing or not enacting or forcing rightness. Bounty extending to myriad generations, but not doing humaneness. Living to high antiquity, but not doing old age. Covering heaven and bearing the earth. Carving and engraving masses of forms, but not doing skill. This is where one wanders, and that's it. I think the idea there is that there's this kind of continuation of the generative processes of nature, but not done deliberately, and certainly not done by appeal to some kind of moral value, right? But still this kind of supporting the generation of nature. The clearest examples, though, I think, are again in the Lu Shi Chunqiu. So this is a kind of direct statement on it. That which begins life is heaven, that which nurtures to completion are human beings. One who can nurture that which heaven gives life to without harming it is called the Son of Heaven. The movements of the Son of Heaven are for the sake of keeping intact the heavenly. This is what the offices are established from. The officials are established to preserve life intact. Now there, I'll have to say, it's a little ambiguous whether it's just human life or not, but the way it's stated makes it sound like it's life in general, right? That's the purpose of establishing government even in the first place. So in these cases you have, I think, a move beyond anthropocentrism, right? So our goal is not just to support human life, but to support life in general. But I think that is still a problem, right? Because in a way it's still not inclusive enough. And I think it comes down to an ambiguity in what one means about life in this context, right? So if we talk about life in distinction from death, then nature is too inclusive of a model in the sense that life and death are both part of nature, right? So you can't, if you're going to oppose life and death, just try to support life, you can't model yourself on nature, right? If we take life in this more fundamental sense as the generative process that includes growth and destruction, right? Then death basically disappears, but then there's really nothing for us to do. Like, what does it mean to foster that process? You can't stop that process, right? There's just nothing to do to keep that process going, right? And so I think you could look at kind of stages of this kind of radicalization of impartiality. So the first is the Moists, who say heaven treats all human beings equally. And I should say that's a radical claim, right? Because it means that you shouldn't prefer people from your state. It means on some level you shouldn't prefer people from your family, right? People have some kind of fundamental equality. So that's a very radical kind of impartiality also. That then gets radicalized further to this idea of caring for all living things, right? Promoting life in general. But that gets radicalized even further to say accepting life and death as equal, right? Which I think means that there's really no need to do anything. And this is what I'm talking about as ultimately a kind of overcoming of ethics, a kind of just accepting things as they are and going along with it. When I say giving up the first part of the dilemma, I don't think I put it back in. I meant to say I start off with the tension between those two propositions of the problem of evil, one being our kind of anthropocentric ethics and the other being the way the world works. It's essentially just giving up any concept of ethics, I think, right? And in which case there's no more problem. You just harmonize with the way the world is and go along with the flow of things. Now, let's see. I want to make sure we leave a half hour. Yeah, okay. This position of taking life and death as equal, I think, is clearest in the Zhuangzi, right? I think that's where it gets worked out most clearly. And I think this passage in particular shows, I think, almost the progression of this radicalized impartiality. So this is part of a broader dialogue that starts off really with one character asking the other character what he knows, and he basically says nothing. And he says, well, I'll tell you the story. And he starts off talking about how animals have different preferences in terms of where to live and in terms of food, and then he moves into erotic beauty, right? And says, monkeys take gibbons as partners, bucks exchange with does, loaches play with fish, Mao Chang and Lady Li are what people consider beautiful, but if fish saw them, they would enter the depths. If birds saw them, they would fly high, and if deer saw them, they would dash away. Of these four, which knows the world's correct beauty? From where I see it, the sprouts of humaneness and rightness and the trails of right and wrong are all inextricably confused and chaotic. How could I know their distinctions? This, I think, is pushing the argument against anthropocentrism, right? It's really trying to say, look, each species has its own set of preferences, and there's no way to know which of those is correct, right? There's no way to sort of step outside of that. It's an argument that, of course, you find in other places. So Sextus Empiricus in the Greek tradition makes basically the same argument and says there's no way for human beings to say their view is the right one because that would have to be done from their viewpoint, right? It would beg the question that for us to make that argument. So the conclusion he draws is that, morality, at the very least, morality is something that's just a kind of human construct, right? It's not an objective part of nature or something like that. I think these are probably kind of metaphors for differences between people as well, right? So that not all people have the same preferences either. But in any case, the clear point of the argument is a kind of move against anthropocentrism. But what's interesting then is this is followed by Nietzsche, the one character says, well, do you know about benefit and harm then, right? So he moves away from moral terms to ask in non-moral terms, benefit and harm. And Wang Ni says, no, basically, right? And then he says, well, do sages or perfected people, completed people, do they know? And he says, no, again, and he gives this story. He says, utmost people are like spirits. A great swamp burning could not make them hot. The He or Han rivers freezing could not make them cold. Violent lightning splitting mountains or fierce winds shaking the seas cannot startle them. In this way they ride the clouds and vapors, mount the sun and moon, and wander outside the four seas. Life and death makes no changes in them, how much less the sprouts of benefit and harm. So granted, this makes it sound like they have magical power so that they can't be killed. But I think the point, and other stories make this point as well, is that they go along with whatever changes happen, right? And so they're not concerned about death or life, right? They're just part of the processes of transformation. And you see this as a way of accepting death in a number of different passages. So you could think about the famous story of Zhuangzi's wife dying, where he compares it to the change of the seasons, right? And that basically the point is everything in nature dies, and says he should not mourn it, right? That to mourn it would be to go against fate, Ming. There are also various sort of exemplary figures where this is applied in a more, I think, a political direction. So one named Wang Tai says, describing him, a man like this doesn't know what his ears or eyes should approve. He lets his mind play in the harmony of virtue. As for things, he sees them as one and does not see their loss. He regards the loss of a foot as a lump of earth thrown away. He was a person who was missing a foot. That's why they have that last comment. Right. Another one says, this man with this virtue of his is about to embrace the 10,000 things and roll them into one. Though the age calls for reform, why should he wear himself out over the affairs of the world? There's nothing that can harm this man. From his dust and leavings alone, you can mold a Yao or a Shun. Why should he consent to bother about mere things? Here you see this, right, acceptance of life and death, this not making judgments about things, right, a kind of total inclusivity, you could say a total impartiality. And you see that it clearly is leading toward a disregard for fixing the world, right? Both of these are saying, there's no possibility of loss. There's nothing to fix, right? That's why the second character, there's no reason for him to bother himself with the troubles of the world, right? Okay, so this, I think, is kind of the natural outcome of this attempt to link human action to nature, at least along these lines of this vitality and this kind of inclusivity. Of course, this is not a very acceptable conclusion in most circumstances, right? So this was not kind of the final story of that. And you have a few different alternatives, right? So the first is what I've been talking about out of Zhuangzi. A second one is just to say, well, this just shows that following nature isn't going to get us anywhere, right? And we need to do something that's not connected with nature, that's not a kind of extension of nature. That's basically Xunzi's position. A A third choice, right, is to try to keep the generative aspect of nature without the impartiality of nature. And I think this happens along two lines. One is arguments that, nature generates all things with a kind of vitality, but as far as I'm concerned, it's only my own vitality that matters, right? My job is to keep my own life going, to preserve myself, right? And that could go in various different directions, some more dangerous maybe, and some less dangerous, you might say. Another version of that is, I think, the idea that we need to extend our natural dispositions, which is basically Mengzi's position. So the lecture on Friday will basically be about that third position, laying out those two options, and then I want to use Zhuangzi ultimately to critique that kind of approach, right? But the last thing I'll talk about today is this fourth option, which is to make a place for both growing and killing. And this points toward what has come to be called correlative cosmology. It really starts arising near the end of the Warring States period and then becomes really dominant in the Han Dynasty. And I could give you lots of examples. The most common one is to use the fact that life and death are both part of nature, to say, this is why the government needs to reward people and punish people, right? That's a case where you imitate the balance of life and death in nature in terms of rewards and punishments. The other common one that they would use is the relationship between the civil or cultural wen and the martial or military wu, right? And I'll give you one example because it's a nice, it illustrates the change well, I would say. And this is the Han Fei's chapter called Jielao, Explanation of the Laozi, right? So this is the original Laozi passage. It's part of Laozi 67. The chapter's longer than that, right? But it says, I constantly have three treasures which I preserve and treasure. The first is called nurturing care. The second is called frugality. The third is called not daring to be first. Now with nurturing care, then one can be brave. With frugality, then one can be broad. Not daring to be first, then one can become the leader of things. So the Han Feizi has a commentary on all of those lines, right? But I want to look at the commentary just on that. With frugality, then one can be broad. So the Han Feizi says, the Duke of Zhou said, if it does not freeze hard in winter days, grass and trees will not flourish in spring and summer. Thus even heaven and earth cannot always be extravagant or always stingy. How much less can human beings? Therefore the myriad things must have prosperity and decline. The myriad affairs must have their rise and fall. The state must have civil and military institutions, and government must have rewards and punishments. For this reason, if wise men frugally use their resources, their families will become prosperous. If the sagely person cares for his spirit, his essence will flourish. And if the ruler of men emphasizes his soldiers for military purposes, his people will become numerous. If his people are numerous, the state will become broad. Right? Now that seems really, really unlikely to be what that Tao Te Ching passage had in mind, right? And you can see, in fact, I think, why the Tao Te Ching doesn't mention death as part of nature, right? Because once you start bringing in life and death as two aspects, you easily head this direction. The Tao Te Ching is generally opposed to war and generally opposed to punishments, right? So this is not a kind of conclusion that I think it wants to lead to, right? It's also, I mean, it's telling that although the point is to have both the generative and the destructive, he places a lot more emphasis on the military purposes there, right? There's this stronger side of that. Now, like I said, this becomes a kind of dominant approach where instead of extending the generative processes of nature, you mimic these kinds of patterns or hierarchies in nature, right? And this is what people call correlative cosmology as it develops. I really think it is actually the dominant conclusion to this question of how you align with nature in Chinese philosophy, like I said, but it becomes dominant really in the Han Dynasty. And I think there's two interesting things to note about this approach. One is that, it's much more favorable to the emperor, right? I think that the idea of nature as generative and inclusive is inherently radical, right? I think it inherently destabilizes political hierarchies. And I think you see that in the Mohists, right, who, of course, they still have political hierarchies, but they should be totally meritocratic. They should be totally open, and the care should be for the people as a whole, right? A very radical political position at the time. And of course, the Zhuangzi, in a way, is so radical as to become apolitical even, right? But it's even a further kind of radicalization of it. I think part of why that line around generativity died out and this one became dominant was the rise of the Han Dynasty, and they needed something more to support this kind of strong hierarchy. The other interesting thing to think about, and I've just thought about this, so I don't know what more to say about it, but is this even a kind of morality or not, right? When you start to say, well, good and bad both have their place, essentially, right? Generation and destruction both have their place. That's almost a move beyond morality, right, towards a true imitation of nature, right? At the same time, you could say, of course, that it's a transformed morality. Now, the moral demand is to imitate these patterns of nature or something like that, right? But I think it's an interesting twist on this kind of problem of evil, where this isn't exactly evil, but it's certainly not good either, right? And in that way, it might actually be a kind of true kind of emulation of nature that's really breaking from a kind of ethics or a kind of morality. Okay, so I'll stop there. Like I said, next time I'll talk more about attempts to keep the kind of generative root while limiting the impartiality, particularly in the Mengzi. And then I'll just take questions. We've got about a half hour if people have questions.
I have some clarification concerning your distinction between the heaven and nature. Your distinction between heaven and nature. My first question is that the concept of nature itself is originated from the nature itself originated from the Western context. Because actually it means kind of physics which generates itself, that kind of thing. But in the Chinese thinking, I think if we just read from some text from Lao Tzu, the Zhiran implies rather modes of kind of the generation instead of object or instead of being subject or being object. Rather, in some sense, from the beginning, actually, what generated and what is generated seems to be entangled with each other. So Zhiran may seem to point to rather kind of a mode of kind of generation or kind of mode of production, or why as we can read from since the main category seems to lie in Tian and Di and Yan. So in that respect, when you mentioned about nature, does it imply the kind of the Di as a kind of a non-human natural object, or whether you have a different concept when you imply the nature as an organism or something? So you think that there's some Chinese equivalence, the Chinese concept which is equivalent to that kind of a living organism that generates itself and makes it turn back to its own productions, ongoing kind of organic function as a whole.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Because I am using nature quite carelessly, I think, using that term, right? I mean, historically, so I wouldn't take the term nature back to sort of physis or the Latin, right? That's the roots are going back there. But I mean, it's what we think of as nature on the one hand is being contrasted with the supernatural, right? Which would be with God. So it's defined on one side by contrast with the divine. And on the other hand, it's being defined as a contrast with the human, right? So you have this opposition between the natural and the artificial, say. So given that the Chinese aren't working with either of those oppositions, right? The word nature can be very misleading. They're not going to have a concept that corresponds exactly to our concept of nature. And so, I don't know what a better word to use is in trying to talk about. So in the Chinese context, right, it's really talking about one whole system, I would say. And Tian is pointing out a divine element of it. And then again, for the Mohists, it seems to be kind of an anthropomorphic God within the system, maybe, right? But some kind of sort of aspect of it. And the human beings are within it, right? They're not opposed to it. They're not distinguished from nature. I think that's very clearly their view. So that, although of course they obviously distinguish human beings from animals and that kind of stuff, on a kind of fundamental level, everything is part of this overall system. I mean, it's a good question. Well, what was the best way to refer to that system, right? I kind of think that nature is maybe still the best way to do it, in that it's become such a broad, vague term that it's not so misleading, maybe. But you could refer to it as the world, you know. I mean, I will sometimes just say the world, but then I tend to use Tianxia for the world. It is important though, because say when I'm talking about, you know, the Moas thinking that nature is structured so that people who inclusively care get rewarded, that certainly includes human actions, right? So their idea is not that if you care for other people, you know, it's always going to be sunny when you want it to be, or something like that. When you care for other people will treat you well, and so you'll tend to benefit. When I talk about nature being structured to reward people, that's part of that process. And when I say nature, that might be misleading, right? Because we don't think of human beings as part of that. I'm not sure the best word for it, though. But I should be more careful about it, at least I think about it more. On the question of this generation, or what defines that system, say, right? I think that there were, in the Warring States period, say at least in the middle Warring States period, I'm not sure that there was one common view, right? So you have an idea of a kind of overarching structure that I think Tien is sometimes used to refer to. You have a focus on maybe the pole star that everything circles around, right? A kind of unitary point. You do have some statements that everything forms one body, but that seems to be relatively late. But this idea that you know, everything's one body, and then you have this idea of Zirang, right? Which I think, well, part of what's difficult to sort out is that they all eventually merge together. So I think ultimately everybody thought the basis of nature was Zirang, right? But at this early time, these are kind of competing discourses. You know? I do think, I mean, one other thing that you were suggesting, I think, is that, and it's kind of a complicated point, but once this generative force becomes zero, right, it's impossible to say whether that lies with the Tao or with things themselves, right? And it's part of actually the overall, if I'm right in sort of connecting these arguments to these arguments in European philosophy about the nature of being, you have a kind of similar issue, right? Because the very nature of being to grow, to generate, then everything that exists will be to some degree generated, right? You no longer rely only with the source, right? So, I mean, you can see I'm influenced by Spinoza. I keep referring to Spinoza, but Spinoza says God is the cause of the world in the same sense that he's the cause of himself, right? The idea there is that everything in the world is sort of self-generating in the same way that being is self-generating, the same way that we could speak of God as self-generating. And I think that is certainly the position that comes up in these texts talking about Zirang, right? So the Tao Te Ching talks about the Tao Fa Zirang, Tao follows Zirang. But it also talks about Wan Wu Zhi Zirang, the Zirang, the spontaneity of the myriad things, right? Where it's a property of the myriad things, not of the Tao. And there's the other passage where the people say word Zirang, right? There seem to be people of Zirang. So you can attribute it kind of to any of these different levels, you know, and that's where I think it's right that you can't distinguish the product and the generation, you know.
I have one question. So I'm really interested in this, drawing this line, you know, between the transition between generation and generation, and then generation and destruction. And in the end here, you've suggested that it seems to be a very plausible way of thinking about this shift. In other words, when do we stop talking about just generation when we're talking about nature as an instance of impartiality, and the linkage to the obvious political use of legitimizing the use of violence as something that imitates nature. So I was thinking about, you know, that seems to imply that in the earlier tradition, when you have that kind of generative picture of heaven and earth, you wouldn't have some distinction. So I'm wondering actually about the title of your book, right? Lao Tzu 5. Hindi Buren, right? So, straw dogs. Do you take that as still part of a picture just about generativity and not about destruction? Or it seems as if maybe there's an implication of disposability and hence destruction in that straw dog idea in a few other places.
Right.
What do you think?
That would be an interesting sort of actually example to look at commentaries on, I think, to see how that's taken up, because it naturally reads that way.
Yeah.
That was like the Shamar commentary that basically says heaven is not benevolent to bad people. If you're good, then it's benevolent to you, right? Right. So to look at kind of alternate readings of that. But I mean, the problem with that is it could easily mean a number of different things, right? Even the claim Chendi Buren that they're not benevolent, it could very well mean that, I take it actually to be a statement about impartiality, and so it has no preferences. It doesn't see human beings as particularly important or any more important than anything else. That's how I would take the most likely meaning of it.
Of the Chendi Buren part.
Yeah. So to just kind of say it's morally indifferent. It could be pointing towards cycles of destruction, right? I mean, if the emphasis on the straw dogs is that there's something that are burned in sacrifice or they're destroyed, right? But it still doesn't seem to really play into that because there's not a sense of generation with the straw dogs either. Like, it seems to me that they become important, they become unimportant, but without any, I don't know. Yeah, it could be read that way, right? But I would lean against reading it that way, as being about this sort of alternate, a place for creation and a place for destruction. Is the Zhuangzi passage that glossed it, is that what it emphasizes?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. That's how we even know, what the story, what the ritual was, I think, right? So that they're trampling afterwards and all that sort of thing.
Right,
I don't remember if the Zhuangzi passage talks about the production, but, in other words, the construction of a straw dog. Maybe someone really knows.
But I think even the Zhuangzi passage seems to be more that things alternate, right? They become important, they become unimportant. Not necessarily that everything dies, right?
Right.
I don't remember that closely, but...
Yeah, we do have passages I mean, this is that reversal theme also with Daojing, right? I mean...
Yeah.
Right, and when you say important or valuable as opposed to unvaluable, non-valuable, is that totally... I mean, exactly as you were saying, Sheng Sheng is about being, it's also about the good, right? It's about what it's valued. It's a sort of an axiological thing. So when it says, they go from being valued to disvalued, it's like I wouldn't discuss it later, it's how you take sort of your tradition. Are those still valued terms? I take them to be. And since there is no real, genuine, like non-being, all that non-being means is disvalued. Way disvalued, so formless that they don't even have a name, a name, a value, a social, right? That's all those things get linked.
Right. And maybe it's actually that there's two slightly different issues, right? So one is whether there's a sense of creation and destruction both having their place, and another is the relativity of value, right? And I mean, those are obviously linked, but the Daojing certainly is putting forward not the relativity of value, but that having one implies the other, right? But it's interesting that it never applies that to war, right? I mean, it does say that there are times when you're forced to go to war, but it never seems to say that there are times when war is what's right and times when peace is what's right, or inequality, or those kinds of things, right? So there's some...
not for those, like, concrete things like war or, taxes.
Could I interject one thing? Sure. Isn't interpreting Zhugo as straw dogs a controversial decision among Daojing commentators?
It's a lost thing, right? Wang Bi doesn't know what it means, right? And he thinks it just means feeding grass is not made for dogs.
with something similar.
Yeah.
It's like heaven treats the myriad creatures as straw and dogs.
That's
the
right.
explanation being
That's right.
spontaneously nourishes them instead of doing something.
Right. No, it's never noticed until quite late, but it is in the Zhuangzi passage, and that one's, I think, unambiguous.
I'm just not committed to that being the original meaning of the
Oh, really?
passage. It's a very understandable commentarial decision to link them to. But if we're thinking in terms of 4th century BC original composition, it's not necessary.
Right, and then you'd have a whole different problem. So then it would be heaven, earth, and benevolence. They treat all things with grass and dogs.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's a comment in the commentaries, but that just seems such a random choice. Why would it be grass and dogs, right? That seems like the strongest argument against that reading to me. Is like, of all the things you would pick, why grass and dogs? And of course, the commentaries should try to explain why it's grass and dogs, but it still seems like, I don't know, a weird choice, given that it could be dog. I mean, well, I don't know, but why would you pick dogs made out of straw of all the things that would be made out of straw?
Right, I mean, I think that the Zhuangzi passage was someone else trying to lost that passage of Leibniz and mistaking its meaning as if it was meaning of some ritual. But it's not linked directly to the passage of Leibniz.
I think we should actually just add the one thing, just sort of on the record, that I'm here reading it down against coherence, right? I actually don't think it has the same form. I think there are multiple things spaces to it. But if you read it as a whole, I think it is sort of leaving out the death side, right? But if I were reading more carefully, I would say they actually leave out two different sort of layers. I don't know, I would have gotten your question. We're right. So I can't really what that is.
It's okay. He wants to go back.
This one? This has been developing over the course of the past few days, right? I more and more think that, I mean, in a way, this and the first position are both equalizing life and death, but in significantly different ways. And it's actually partly as we're discussing it, that's becoming more clear that in fact, there's like two variants on the same view.
Right, and we do get that in this passage, even the last one, the Shao-Zhi, chapter 25, which was for sure, life, death.
Yeah.
Martial, military, right.
So it's specifically on impartiality because he actually makes use of the word gen either once or twice in his text, where it says, like, I'm doing other parts of my life. Like, so, like, gentle act, I'm being impartial to my love. So that's why I nourish all the parts of my life. But he also says at the same time that if in a term of hardship, somebody is forced to choose between, let's say, one's middle finger and the ring, then of course the wise judgment would be choose the ring. So I think he's he's sort of ambiguous in this attitude, and there's some kind of tension between the idea of partiality and impartiality. That's why he has this idea of a gradation of 12 orders, because if, like, the pedestrian and your parents are both sort of in a situation, in a dangerous situation, then you would probably say, in that case, the impartial judgment would be the sacred heart, the death or the stranger. You don't know. So I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, I think on the connection of Jan and character about that passage, right? Part of the issue, so translating actually poem or Jan is difficult, right? Because the core meaning of Jan is not really impartial, it's inclusive, right? Yeah. It's doing multiple things at the same time. So there's actually not a contradiction between Zhuangzi saying we inclusively care for our whole body, but subject priority over the others. The Moas might not want to use Jan that way, maybe, but they might. But in any case, like, there's not really a contradiction between those. I would say that I think Zhuangzi is, what makes his position really interesting to me is that I think on the one hand, he does see nature as in some sense impartial, right? And this goes to somebody who was asking, maybe, I don't remember if it was you or who was asking me about the 500-year cycle or the descriptive aspect of Tian, right? There it does seem like, regardless of what's good or bad, what's going on, heaven just has this kind of impartial order that keeps going on and on. And what Zhuangzi is trying to do is kind of admit that and then say that's the wrong perspective for us, right? Our perspective should be as embodied human beings who have certain ways of reacting. So I think that he's actually not denying this kind of inclusivity or impartiality, but he's trying to say that's not the relevant sort of issue for us or something like that. Is that interesting?
Maybe in terms of your comparative work between Western and Eastern thinking, so as far as I understand, the main thrust of comparison lies in that Western concept seems to focus more on the abstract concept of being, while the Chinese concept mainly focuses on the vitality, being as a vitality, or some self-organizing force working within the whole world. So my one question is that, first of all, the one exception is a stoicism, which does not take its reference for not abstract concept of being, but the concept of cosmos as the material, the whole concept of material reality, which is organized, the logos, which is also embodied within that whole organized whole. In that respect, my one question is why stoicism is considered as an exception to the categorization of Western thinking, and also my another question is also it's still related to the stoicism, because stoicism also points to that the impartiality as my individual life is also, even though my individual life is sacrificed to the whole, still it is worse, and the death and the issue of the death and life does not matter. If it is seen from my individual constant, then it matters, but if it is considered from the whole system of the organic whole, then it doesn't matter. There are many points that you just raised that impartiality also comes to emerge within the stoicism thinking. So also, because they clearly situate each individual's value of life in the whole context of the organic whole, which has its own embodiment as well as its own rule following or some, its own principles. So in that respect, my question is related to the kind of possible link to the stoicism.
Yeah, so I should say if I said something about Western thinking I didn't mean to do that, right? I try to very carefully pick out specific instances to make comparisons around. And because I'm thinking about the problem of evil, I'm thinking of it primarily in a kind of let's say a Christian and kind of post-Christian context, right? And not thinking so much about the Greeks. That's just kind of where I've been focusing the problem. But I more and more do think that there are certain sort of premises that if you take them, right, there's kind of natural directions for them to go, at least, which is why I do think there are similarities between the stuff going on in China and, like I said, say Spinoza and Leibniz. Well, Spinoza in a lot of ways is very influenced by Stoicism, or seems very similar to Stoicism, right? And I think you would find some kind of similar things there. Part of Stoics would be really interesting to bring into it, right? And I'll admit that, in a lot of ways I love Stoicism, particularly as like a kind of practical doctrine. Actually, before I read Zhuangzi, I guess I kind of considered myself a Stoic, and then I read Zhuangzi and thought, like, this is like Stoicism except he's happy. The Stoics always need this kind of Stoic, right? And Zhuangzi seems happy, and it's kind of the same thing, and I kind of shifted over to that. But philosophically, I've never quite understood how the Stoics reconcile their conception of sort of duty and moral action with the kind of fatalism and this kind of view of a kind of, total organism and that kind of thing. So because I've never quite understood how they do that, I don't know how to address it. But I would say that if you take this model of generation and vitality and add in some kind of principle of order, right? Then you get a very different worldview. And I'm thinking here particularly of the Neo-Confucians, right? So the Neo-Confucians take up this fundamental aspect of Shang, right? It's fundamental in Neo-Confucianism, right? It's very clear in Zhuangzi, all of it. And they very specifically say that Ren, right, benevolence is an extension of Shang, right? So this is a case where they're trying to, again, derive ethics from the generative force of nature. And what's interesting is, of course, that was the anti-Confucian position in the Warring States period, right? The Confucians didn't want to go that direction of Shun and impartiality because it has this kind of radical leveling involved. The Neo-Confucians can kind of embrace that and embrace a kind of total impartiality because once you do that, there's still the lead that leads you into the hierarchies and gives you a kind of sense of order and that kind of thing. So there's a sense in which you could be totally impartial, but you would still be acting morally because there's this kind of, that's the lead, right? That's what that explains how that's possible. There's nothing like that in this early context that would sort of keep this impartiality from going in a more radical direction. So my sense is that the Stoics have something more like what the Neo-Confucians have that allows them to keep a sense of moral duty, which would be the logos or would be reason, right? But again, I've never quite understood how that works.
There's a one specific aspect of chapter of probably has to do with the idea of reality, where it says to observe the body when we want the body, or look at the body when we want the body, look at the village when we want the village, look at the state when we want the state, which is very interesting because we're not looking at the state when we want a citizen in the state or an individual in the state, but sort of taking the view of the state to look at the state. In which case, the object of one's view is aligned with the viewpoint of the viewer. So I wonder if you have any comment on that, because I just think it's an interesting chapter to think about in relation to the problem of partiality.
Yeah. That's one of those passages that I just feel like that we just can't figure out what it really means. I don't really have a view because I've never been quite clear on, it can be taken in a number of different ways, and I'm not sure how to sort out the proper way to take it. It does have some echoes of the Lu Shunzhi passage that says, Tian Sha is Tian Sha's Tian Sha. Right?
Yeah,
Tian Sha,
Tian
Sha.
Yeah, that's right.
And that would connect to a kind of impartiality, and I would like that reading of it. But I think it's so minimal that there is pretty hard to figure out just what exactly that means. But yeah, I mean, it might make sense. And love that actually also.
You never read that. Not really. It reminds me. Yeah. It's only in the different sort slightly different way, but it's also not personal. That's not
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look at that and see if that seems to be the way that it's going. I haven't thought about that before.
So when I hear generation, I think of corruption as a pyramid for classical Western reasons. And I just had a thought, which would help us maybe transition into Friday's talk, which is the extent to which a lot of the material of Zhuangzi could be seen as reflecting about nature's constantly corrupting and always being partial, universally.
Always being partial or impartial?
Partial. In that nature consists of infinity of things that are constantly being broken as well as created. And of of which, like, we shouldn't expect any kind of robust impartiality. What we can expect is that they all have a common character, and appreciating their common partiality is a way of engaging with them that is intelligent and insightful. But trying to escape from partiality to impartiality, and trying to embrace generation without corruption is often difficult.
So you're saying not just that things that are formed have partiality, but that there's no beyond partiality.
I'm thinking of the bits in which you blend and pair chung with clay or clay, which I take to be something like, to be formed is precisely to be fluid, and which requires interpretation, obviously. But I mean that the formation of things is a kind of destruction at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think it's significant that it uses chung there instead of chung, right? So chung is so there's this common, that the passage of the Dao passage I gave starts with Dao Shang, right? Dao generates an end with tools, right? So this not dichotomy, but birth, that's a kind of first stage, and Chung confusion as the final stage is a kind of common distinction. And so, yeah, so I don't know if that changes the point, right? I think the problem with the Zhuangzi is that I don't think it's arguing for some kind of opinionlessness, kind of impartiality, right? It's arguing for a kind of utter flexibility in how one views things, so that one has a view at any point. In that sense, you could say that it's always partial. But insofar as that view can always be changed, there's a way in which I think it could still be described as impartial, right? Because the partiality is never fixed, you could say. And so you could be partial to life, and then, I mean, the way I read the Zhuangzi is, of course you try to stay alive and that kind of thing, but then when you see that you're going to die, you think, hey, death's fine too, right? And now you think death is good, and so you're still upset about it. And so there's a way in which that is a kind of constantly shifting partiality, I think you could say. But I think there's a kind of recognition, let's say, that any partial perspective is kind of flexible. I don't know. That's not quite strong enough of what I want to say. I don't know if that addresses it enough.
There's a moment in Zhuangzi 13, a discussion about virtues ren and yi, and how they interact with shape. Specifically, the argument being made that ren and yi are not shaped, so they aren't shaped. And the character Lao utters a phrase that's something like embracing impartiality is a form of partiality. I forget the exact word, but it strikes me that one single difference, again, I think the Zhuangzi is highly positive.
Yes.
Sort of chaos of different voices, but one interesting signal thing that those voices keep bringing to the foreground, as distinct from something like the Tao Te Ching, one more governmentally oriented thing, is a respect for both sides of alternation as a process of the world, which is that if Tao is something like the pattern of things or the way things come about, then it's constantly ruining everything. It's just as central to its identity as it's constantly creating. So, like, if you were to come into a better relationship with the universal process, it would have nothing to do with identifying yourself more with generation. Except insofar as generation is just simultaneously corruption.
Yeah, I mean, so probably I would agree with that, right? This is why I think the Zhuangzi undoes this idea of fostering life as a goal. But the Zhuangzi is, I think, composite, right? So there are parts I think have this idea of fostering life in general, but I think, say, the inner chapter's position or the Qi position, maybe, right, seems to be denying that, right? To say that there's no priority of life over death, of shang generation. I still think, though, that there is some, that we're probably slipping between that ambiguity around life that I said, right? So shang in the sense of what's opposed to death, and a more fundamental sense of this kind of continual generation that's always going on. So on the level of life as opposed to death, it's certainly giving up any kind of fixed preference between those, right, and sort of equalizing those. But an idea that fundamentally, that the Tao is not fundamentally generative. I don't know that that's there. I don't know if they could conceive that or what that would even mean, though, in a way, in that context. So I think there is a sense that. So there's no sense that, you have millions of years cycles in which there's complete non-existence and then there's existence, something like that, right? There's a sense in which Sheng Wuxi, I think, is not denied anywhere in the Zhuangzi, right? I mean, it obviously don't have a phrase, but that position, I think, isn't denied anywhere. It's just when you start distinguishing life from death, which is always about particular individual things, right? That you have this interdependence of them, or this kind of equalizing of them. And I do think, this critiques of impartiality, those kinds of things. I agree that Zhuangzi tends to recognize both sides all the time, but there's very little about why you should make yourself super frustrated sometimes. You know what I mean? That's not really an alternation that it values both sides of, that, sometimes you should wander freely and easily, and sometimes you should get extremely angry and frustrated and get locked into your viewpoint. Right? Now, I take it there's no claim that one is better than the other than the fact that most people would prefer to be happy, But I still think there is some level on, there's a sense you can have perspectives at different times, right? And being locked onto always having impartiality would be being fixed on one thing. But the idea of, fixation as sometimes desirable and flexibility as sometimes desirable, I don't think is really in there, I see that you're looking skeptical.
That's more. I was thinking of the passage in chapter 4 about duty and all that sort of thing. There's some appeal to inescapability, which you have to, I don't know what that is. Anyway, I think we're out of time, and let's thank our speaker. It'll be a cliffhanger until Friday.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.